Africa is considered the poorest continent on Earth. In a 2021 UN report, Africa played host to 33 of the world's least developed countries, over 2 times the number in the rest of the world. Colonialism has some role to play here. Since the late 1800s, imperial European powers have sought to invade, occupy, and exploit African nations. Brutally violent campaigns led by imperialists made it difficult for African nations to develop economically. But many countries, not just in Africa, were colonised. This can't be the only reason for Africa's poverty today. So, what else might be going on here?
The enormous amount of hand labor required to grow and pick the cotton was supplied by great numbers of slaves.
Families were torn apart.
Ground to the plantation. Cheap slave labor.
Long before Africa's period of colonial rule, the continent simultaneously faced 4 slave trades. These lasted for several hundred years, up until the 19th century. This led economist Nathan Nunn to investigate the effect of the slave trade on the lack of development of African nations today.
I was thinking about why is Africa so poor or economically underdeveloped? My first thought was, colonialism. But then you think, it wasn't only the African continent that was colonized. But then the unique thing, which was before colonialism, was the slave trade.
Nathan soon formed a hypothesis. He thought that those countries which had more of their population taken away by the slave trade might likely be the same nations which were poorer and less developed today. But this was just a theory, which needed to be backed up with empirical evidence and data. It turns out that there was already a database which detailed thousands of slave trade voyages from Africa. This had been compiled by historians from various records such as ship registrations and voyage plans. This allowed Nathan to calculate the number of slaves shipped from each different port across Africa, and therefore he could know the number of individuals taken from each coastal country, which would allow him to start to test his hypothesis. But there was an issue. Just because a large number of slaves were shipped from a country did not mean that the individuals necessarily came from that coastal nation. Slaves were often transported long distances from one country to another.
Just because an individual was shipped from the coast of Nigeria, for example, that doesn't mean that they were captured in Nigeria or anywhere near that. They were often marched or transported hundreds of kilometers, even thousands of kilometers.
To solve this problem, Nathan needed to know the ethnicity of slaves. He used many historical documents, such as records of sale, fugitive slave lists, court records, and runaway notices, to compile this ethnicity data. This allowed him to differentiate between those slaves which had been taken from coastal nations and those which had been transported long distances from other nations towards coastal ports.
So in the end, I think we had over 100,000 individuals for which we knew their ethnicity.
But this information was limited to the transatlantic slave trade, the movement of slaves from Africa to the Americas. 3 other slave trades in the Red Sea, Indian Ocean, and across the Sahara Desert also accounted for large numbers of African individuals forcibly transported abroad. To find ethnicity data from these slave trades, Nathan travelled to archives in Zanzibar, Tanzania. He hoped that there he could find more information from documents that hadn't yet been digitised.
I didn't even have permission at that point, just because things are often so delayed. And eventually I just hopped on a plane and went there and then sat in the waiting room of the archive until somebody helped me.
Thankfully, Nathan did find the data on ethnicities which he needed to continue his research. With this in hand, Nathan was finally able to discover whether those countries which had been worse affected by the slave trade really were the countries which struggle most economically today. Let's start to consider Nathan's findings by plotting them on a chart. Along the x-axis is the log number of slaves taken for a given area. The further to the right, the greater the number of slaves taken from that country. Along the y-axis is the log real GDP per capita. Simply put, this is the average income of the individuals living in each country. Add in all the African nations and you can start to see a trend. Take Namibia for example. It experienced a relatively small slave trade and also happens to have a relatively high average income today compared to other African nations. In contrast, Nigeria was greatly affected by the slave trade and today has a relatively low average income. Draw in the correlation, and it starts to become clear that those nations which face greater levels of slave exports today have lower levels of wealth. The African countries that are poorest today are the ones from which the most people were taken. But why might this be? What appears to be going on here is that those countries which were exploited more by the slave trade suffered lower levels of trust. The entrapment of slaves resulted in infighting within the affected nations.
My co-author, Leonard Wanchikan, I mentioned he was from southern Benin. When he learned about the research or saw me present, the immediate thing he thought about was trust. Intuitively, he thought, oh, well, the slave trade affected interpersonal trust, which makes sense when you step back and think of it, because, well, how were individuals enslaved? It wasn't Europeans coming in and enslaving people who were from the continent. It was people from the continent who were turning on one another.
This lack of trust greatly lessens the stability of these nations, making it harder for economic growth to occur. So, African countries are, to some extent at least, so poor today because of the historical effects of the slave trade.
Thank you to Nathan Nunn for his support as part of this project. Please watch further videos in our series delivered by Discover Economics and Cage Research Centre. Please visit our website and follow us on social media.